Well, ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit in November, several key meetings are taking place involving numerous stakeholders that also include the Energy Transition Working Group. To unpack this further is our SABC News specialist researcher, Velemseni Mthiyane. Veli, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, another segment of the G20 Focus, and this one is a very important one. We're talking here energy transition. Let's speak about just the working meetings that have been taking place behind the scenes. We know, of course, that there's that Energy Transition Working Group. They've been having technical meetings. Electricity, energy is such a contentious issue in South Africa at the moment. Just give us a sense of what these conversations are about and what the key priorities are during these talks. Let's see if you can unpack all of that for us.
Well, good afternoon to you, Unanti, and good afternoon to the viewers at home. Yes, of course, there's been a lot that has been happening when it comes to energy transition working group under G20 banner, South Africa's presidency. Yeah. And one of those key three priorities have been stated. If we look in terms of energy security, we know, Unati, that South Africa in the African continent is the most electrified country. And because remember that as we are the presidency of G20, but we're not only looking into South Africa, but we're looking into the continent and also looking into the whole world. So the issue of affordability and the issue of reliable access. When it comes to the issue of reliable access, later on we're going to speak about the issues that South Africa has been facing. Reliable access, but there has been the issue of load shedding. Reliable access, but there's been the issues of high electricity prices, which are threatening the access to electricity, mainly for the majority of low-earning citizens of the country. And another point they're looking at is the just, affordable, and inclusive energy transition. You have rightly said that how are we making sure that in the future the energy is greener, but also fair. And then it talks about the just and affordable and inclusive nature, because the cost of transitioning from the fossil fuels to green energy is very high, but yet at the same time it is very necessary considering the dire consequences that the global warming is having when it comes to these issues. And then of course it talks about African interconnectivity and the power pools in terms of how do we ensure that the continent itself escalates in terms of ensuring that there is more energy in the country. Remember, also on the continent, because the economies cannot grow if there is not sufficient energy that can power those economies.
Absolutely. Let's look at the African continent. I want us to specifically focus on energy development. What can you tell us there?
Sure, and there's a lot that has been happening. First and foremost, I think we should just mention that when it comes to South Africa, 30% of the electricity used in Africa comes from South Africa. And we know that in South Africa, more than 90% of the electricity that we are having comes through from Eskom. But again, if we look into the point of South Africa is contributing heavily when it comes to total emissions on the African continent, it's estimated is around about 40%. And again, when it comes to the third point in terms of the decarbonization and dealing with the greenhouse gas emissions, South Africa has a target of that ranges between 350 to 420 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent when it comes to the variable greenhouse gas emissions. And then they are saying by 2030, but they are saying they aim to achieve the net zero emissions by 2050. The question is, are we doing enough to ensure that by 2030 we are at least at this level? And are we doing enough in the next 25 years that we have achieved the net zero emissions by 2050? And then of course we look in terms of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, of which it's one of the key tools that that's been made available for the countries to transition from the fossil fuels to the green energy. And if we look in terms of South Africa, we have been given about $8.5 billion as part of this Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is made up of various whether grants and then loans and so forth. And then again, for South Africa, they looked at about 1.5 trillion that could be used to achieve the goal of nationally determined contributions to the United Nations. And that's where South Africa is when it comes into, and the continent as a whole, when it comes to the issue of energy.
And I want to use the word that you used. I mean, South Africa is one of the world's most carbon intensive economies. Speak to us then, Veli, about the electricity generation mix. Just maybe speak to the slide in terms of what are we looking at here?
Sure. Unati, if you can look into, as the graphic will show us, the breakdown shows that about more than 80% of our electricity is generated using fossil fuels, mainly coal. Right, and then we know that going into the future, it is envisaged that goes a little lower, so that there is more room for the renewables, right? But also, in terms of the renewables at the moment, around about 13% of the energy mix, and then of course nuclear somewhere between 3 to 5%. So that's where we are. And then, as it's listed here, coal is number one contributing to our energy, and hence the high level of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we're looking in terms of the solar contributions, they are growing. We're looking in terms of the wind is also growing. So basically it says that the bulk of our energy still comes through fossil fuels, and South Africa needs to act, and act very fast, but act fairly, and act in a way that is considerate of South Africa's position financially. That's why the issue of climate change financing, and also in terms of adaptability, we go on the way in terms of how do we then finance the transition from fossil fuels to green energy.
And I want to talk to our guest about nuclear, in terms of also the concerns there around nuclear waste. But let's move on now and talk about just how the picture looks like in terms of the spend, how expensive electricity is. I mean, just recently reminded of what the Minister of Electricity and Energy has said about the threats of energy poverty. I mean, let's look then at access to electricity in terms of, are electricity prices really just threatening access to electricity, especially for the majority of South Africans? So very quickly, Veli, if you can, just speak to this particular slide.
Interesting, Unati, is that about 2 decades ago, South Africa had one of the cheapest electricities in the world, but that picture has suddenly changed. As we look into this graphic, you can see that between 2007 and 2024, the electricity prices have grown by 937%. And then now, if you look in terms, if you compare that with inflation, that Eskom tariff that have been granted by NEXA with inflation, you can then see that there is a disconnect, and the inflation has grown with about 155%, yet the electricity tariffs have gone with about 937%. That's a huge disconnection between the inflation and the Eskom tariffs. So it's becoming more and more inaccessible for the poor people to afford electricity in this country.
And talking about inaccessibility, let's take our viewers to this next point. But Veli, thank you so much for that. Of course, that was SABC News specialist researcher Velemseni Mthiyane.